welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody being here from both Europe and North America. Hey, Patricia, how are you? Good to see you. Okay. Hey, everybody else. Mr. Molson, how are you?
Good.
So, listen, this is always fun. John Molson and I, like Keith, we go back almost 3 decades that we've been doing business together. And I want to share a little bit about John. First of all, John was one of the three founders of Immunotech. I mean, way back, 1995, 1996, when this project was being put together, and it was just a research project at that point out of McGill University. John had the foresight to say, this product is going to be a game changer for people. He saw that. He was a visionary in that respect, along with his two partners, Dieter Beer, who's German, of course, and Chuck Roberts, who is Canadian. In addition to that, John has been a pro athlete. He's been a cyclist many years, been a triathlete, still works out diligently every single day. On top of that, his son is a professional athlete. He's been in the National Football League as a kicker. In addition to that, his family's been involved in the sports business for many years in Canada. They own one of the premier franchises in all of professional sports, the Montreal Canadiens hockey team. In addition to that, his family sponsors sporting events throughout the world. Okay, so he knows a lot about a lot of different things when it comes to my favorite word, ergogenics. And ergogenics is basically performance enhancement. Okay, so it's very important, not only for athletes. I mean, obviously, 1/10 of 1% of people on the planet are elite athletes, but 99 and 9/10% of us are people who have to go out and perform every single day. We have to perform to feed our families. We have to perform in our businesses. We have to perform, some of us are still performing. My friend Rudy's on here, who's a triathlete at 77 years old, for example. Okay. Some of the rest of you are participants in different things in senior level athletics. So, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time, more important than that, performance for life. And John is an expert in that, certainly. He's our research ambassador. Well, what does that mean exactly? That's a broad term, right? We hear ambassador, we think of the United Nations or whatever. Well, in John's case, it means that he deals with all the different researchers around the world, different names that you'll hear. Dr. Larry Lance, for example, who did a performance study in Ontario a number of years ago. Dr. Lewis, who runs Orico, which is a sports performance company out of Ireland. Dr. Linsman, who's done our studies, for example, on TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, et cetera, et cetera. John deals with all of these individuals on a collective basis, helps them to get what they need in terms of funding, in terms of product, in terms of information for Immunotech. So he's got a very key role. So when you hear these things, and I'll give you one last example. We've all heard about the Miami soccer team that's been involved with Immunotech now for the last year, almost 2 years now. And the great Lionel Messi, right? Greatest player in the world, I believe. I'm not a big soccer guy, but I believe he's the #1 player in the world, or certainly one of them. And that relationship was a result of John's relationships with Orico and with Dr. Lewis, okay, as one of many examples of the different tips of the spear that John touches in terms of Immunical and Immunotech. So it's my privilege to welcome both a good friend and a man I learned a great deal from about Immunical on a regular, consistent basis, even after 28 years, my friend, Mr. John Molson. John, how are you today?
Great.
So, John, let's get right into it. There are many references in some of the early scientific papers about Immunical's similarity to human milk. Can you explain how it's similar?
Yeah. And this is very important because human milk was the model for Dr. Buno's. So that's how he evaluated and measured the effectiveness of Immunical, is vis-a-vis what human milk does and what it gives to the baby, the neonate. So when the baby is born, human milk is 100% whey. And when the baby is about 3 months old, human milk shifts to 80% whey, 20% casein. Now, cow's milk is the exact reverse. Is 20% whey, 80% casein. The key proteins found in human milk also exist in that fraction of cow's milk, but obviously the quantities vary. So human milk for him became the standard. And the idea was is that you preserve these key protein fractions, not all of them, some of them, in their what's called their native conformation. And this is what he found imparted this benefit to the mice and to humans, etc.
So, John, Dr. Bunos would do an evaluation of Immunical's purity versus other protein sources that we're all familiar with, be it chicken, be it fish, be it meat, etc. How did he explain and do that comparison, and how did he evaluate the outcome of Immunical being superior to all other protein sources?
Yeah, so one of the ways he explained it to me was, if you look at the bacteria count in, for instance, milk and cheese, it's measured in the thousands. In Immunical, it's measured in the hundreds. And when they remove the lactose from Immunical, they subject it to water. So all the water-soluble toxins are removed, and then it's defatted, so all the fat-soluble toxins are also removed. So you have a very pure protein versus, what you see in fish, in meat, etc. So, on a comparative basis, you're dealing with something that's extremely pure.
So, if you could explain the difference between denatured versus undenatured and why it's important in terms of the standpoint of Immunical.
Now, this is critical because, if you look at the early scientific work of Dr. Bunos, I mean, he and Dr. Patricia Kongshaven, through their different evaluations, looking at different data, reading papers, etc., became to understand what the mechanism was. But before they really had a grasp on it, all of a sudden the experiment stopped working. And they came to the realization that temperature or excessive temperature affects the mechanism of action of this product. And what it does, it's like if you look at a protein molecule, it looks like a ball of wool. And if you heat that ball of wool excessively, it unravels, and it doesn't affect the nutritional value of the product. It affects its biological activity. And so, the same way you cook an egg, you don't change the nutritional value, but you change the conformation of these proteins, which affects, again, the biological activity. And so that's, became something very important to him in terms of how we move to produce Immunical in the lab to an industrial setting and preserve this.
And let's talk about packaging for a minute. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the folks that are on the call here with us this afternoon, John, are new. They're in Germany, they're in Austria, they're in other markets that are new for Immunitech. And they may wonder, as do a lot of people still in North America when they join the business, why do we use envelopes instead of containers like so many other companies do for protein products?
Again, one of the things that will denature the product is moisture. So, if the product is submitted or sits in a humid environment, it's going to cause the product to denature, obviously at varying rates depending on the environment. And so it's packaged in individual sachets, which preserves the mechanism of action, but also is very important vis-a-vis the shelf life of the product. So you have a 2-year shelf life because it's sealed in that environment.
And let's talk a little bit about studies. I mean, we've had 85 plus publications to date. Can you describe what that entails?
Yeah, so as I explained, Dr. Bunos always described this discovery as serendipity. And so, like most things in life, you don't start out trying to discover something. Through his incredible background, his incredible insight, and marrying the opportunity with having, working in a teaching hospital, the equivalent of Harvard, those early days of the Montreal General, where you had these incredible researchers together with Dr. Kongshaven there with her mouse models. All of this came together. And the 85 publications is really, it's like a story looking at how they went from the earliest days and describing what they potentially had to then, understanding in different pathologies, why Immunical acts the way it does, how it acts, etc. So it's a chronological history of the science of discovery.
And in our clinical trials, both past and present, what's the dosage that's used?
Uh, they settled on 20 grams. And, the key concept here that Dr. Bunas explained to me, as you see in nature, more is not better. So there's a delicate balance between, not enough, too much, and just enough. And this is, why he used human milk as the standard bearer. In other words, that human milk has very specific percentages in terms of the protein, cysteine content, etc. And so this was his model.
And how about when we do trials with children, for example, the autism study? What was the dosage for
Yeah,
children?
so again, there was a lot of pediatric work done in pediatric cancer, pediatric AIDS, autism, and they came up with a formula of zero point 0.5 grams per 2.2 pounds of body weight for kids under 40 pounds.
And how is Immunotech able to get the claims in Canada? And this is huge, folks. I want you to hear this, John. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what this really means and how big this is in the Canadian market, certainly, on immune function. The fact that we actually can make claims in Canada on the immune function and performance of Immunical.
Yeah, so, when we started out, we were faced with many, many obstacles that we had to overcome. When Dieter Beer, the original research was funded by the National Research Council of Canada. And when the genome came into vogue, then they pulled the funding from Dr. Bunos. And this is when, he had his depression and he had great difficulty psychologically because he had been working on this for years and he was on the verge of these different developments, and all of a sudden the Canadian government decides that's it, we're going to fund the genome, and that's when Dieter Beer stepped in. So he continued funding it and basically carried on until today.
And let's talk a little bit, John, about the fact that there's a new paper put out by Harvard recently that reveals a troubling factor about the increase in dementia. Can you talk about it and how Immunical helps to combat this phenomenon?
Yeah, that's the one of the things that Dr. Bruno spoke to me about extensively, besides the effect on immune function, was the effect on essentially pollution and how insidious pollution is. And this whole story is about inflammation. Many of these processes that we studied have an inflammatory component. And one of the key things you have to understand is, that what happens in either preceding disease or during the disease process is you have this pro-oxidant or inflammatory environment where you have glutathione depletion, cysteine depletion, and by normalizing this, you mediate the inflammation. And so this is what we found vis-a-vis diseases, like dementia, et cetera. They definitely have an inflammatory component in the brain. And a source of that inflammatory component is pollution. And in this particular article, they talked about particulate matter, which is emitted by diesel exhaust. And what's interesting, one of our earliest studies was in asthma, exercise-induced asthma. And we collaborated with a researcher at a U.S. university who actually worked with a U.S. Olympic team in Lake Placid. And he found that the female hockey players had airway remodeling and airway inflammation. And they discovered later that it was due to the Zambonis that were burning diesel exhaust and emitting it and, causing this inflammation. Anyways, we ran a study and Immunical was able to, excuse me, prevent this from occurring and normalize their breathing function. So, we saw early on its benefits.
And let's talk a little bit, John, about the history of Immunotech, the company, because many of these people are new. We got some old timers here, but we've got some new folks as well. You had a very famous meeting between yourself, Chuck Roberts, Dieter Beer, and I believe Alex Koenigsberg. I think you were at the marina, and when this kind of all got decided on who was going to do what and how this all kind of played out, and here we are almost 30 years later, and we've got a successful brand, successful company. We're launching new markets, et cetera, et cetera. And, the rest is history, as they say. But if we could go back for a minute, those almost 30 years ago, to that famous meeting between you guys, talk about that a little bit. How did it all come about?
Yeah, it's interesting because Dieter, before we met, was thinking of ways to commercialize this product and had met with a number of pharma companies, both in Canada, in Europe, as well as Asia. And he couldn't put the right deal together. And one of the largest pharma companies in Canada, the chief researcher for this company, who had retired, had phoned Dieter and wanted Immunical for his mother, who was very sick with advanced cancer. And they were talking, and he asked Dieter, have you done a deal with any of the pharma companies? And Dieter said, no, we can't find the right deal. He said, don't do that. He said, go directly to the population. And after that, through one of our lawyers who knew, I think either a notary or a lawyer for Dieter, set up a meeting between myself, Dieter, and Chuck and Dr. Bunos in Chuck's office at Roberts Evergreen. And we sat for a couple of hours. It was, incredibly intimidating meeting Dr. Bunos for the first time. And I was only worried about not saying the wrong thing. It's you meet an eminent scientist and you don't know like what he's talking about really at that time. But he brought, loads and loads of research, and they talked about all the different opportunities and, potentially about taking this directly to the general population. And Dr. Bunos told me that after they had the meeting, they're driving back into Montreal, and Dieter asked Dr. Bunos, so what did you think of the meeting? And he said to Dieter Beer, I like Chuck and John. So fortunately, he said that, and we were able to put a deal together, which I think we signed in November, and the company started in 1997 in January.
The rest, as they say, is history, right? So,
Yeah.
a couple other questions, John, as long as I've got you, and we got a couple of minutes left here. For the sake of our friends in Europe, a couple of names come up, three significant names come up in relevance to Immunotech, Immunical in Europe. The first one we've already just mentioned a couple of times, one of your two partners, Dieter Beer. You want to tell people a little bit about Dieter, who, by the way, is still living. He's 87. He just went to a meeting last weekend with our colleague Jim Spencer in Toronto. So he's still going strong at 87. But anyway, tell people a little bit about Dieter and his background, because I think it's relevant that they know, once again, not only your origin, but also Dieter's origin business-wise.
Well, he was a very successful businessman and, very determined, very bright. He had one of the largest electronics distribution companies in Europe, and he sold it. And he, was the type of entrepreneur that looked at different opportunities and funded them. And that's what he did when he eventually spoke with Dr. Bunos, is his family was very interested in alternative medicine, so to speak. And so he understood exactly when he met Dr. Bunos what Dr. Bunos was talking about and the potential application. And so he set up an office for Dr. Bunos and started funding this research and funding the patent applications that emanated from the research. So we're very fortunate because, I was able to Dr. Bunos talked about this, the fact that, we spent a lot of money, and I'm talking millions of dollars, running these studies. We ran them over, we're still finishing them off, but over a 25-year period. And because Dieter knew the importance of doing that. And so we had a champion. And I was always, really grateful for that. So many of those studies that you see today are the result of having Dieter as a champion uh, and backing it.
And the second name that comes up occasionally, it should come up more, but it comes up occasionally, is Dr. Luc Montagnier. And I remember, John, walking into Chuck Roberts' office at the first building we were in. This was in about 1998. And there's a book about that thick, hopefully you can see my hands here, about that thick, a medical textbook called Treating Oxidative Stress in Cancer and HIV. And it's by a Dr. Luc Montagnier from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And Chuck went to, I believe it was chapter 47, which was all about the usage of Immunical with a family that was HIV infected. But you want to talk about Montagnier a little bit, Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Luc Montagnier, by the way, and his importance in the development of Immunical?
Well, some of our researchers had worked at the Pasteur Institute, and Dr. Montagnier was at a World's AIDS Congress, I believe in Japan, where he talked about this article and some of the work done in pediatric AIDS patients. So anytime you get people like that, who work at an institute, or you get mentioned by people like that, that tells you the importance of the work and the product.
And he won the Nobel Prize. Do you remember what year it was that he won for HIV?
No.
I don't either. Keith, do you remember by any chance what year that was?
2008.
2008 Nobel Prize winner. So this was a book, and I know some of you are medical doctors on the call here. Some of you are nurses, like my friend Patricia up in Saskatchewan. So you're all familiar. When I say a medical textbook this thick, I'm not exaggerating. This is something you could do curls with and get a good workout, right? And the fact that a Nobel Prize winner had both used our product in his research, and in addition to that, had taken the due diligence to write about it and report on it, was very, very significant. And finally, John, a guy who became a good friend of yours, who I got to know fairly well as well, who came here and brought Immunical to the presence really of the athletic community because of the anti-inflammatory response, and contributed so much to Immunitech in the very few short years he was here, happens to be a German. And his name was Dr. Wolf Droge. And you want to talk about Dr. Droge a little bit? Because once again, some of the folks are familiar with him, some of the folks are not, but played a very significant role once again in the development of our brand.
Yeah, first of all, I want to apologize to everybody because I was distracted. Dr. Droge, I didn't answer the question earlier. Dr. Droge was a gentleman, we were very fortunate, who put together all the data and presented it to the Canadian government to get our claim on immune function. So he was instrumental in that, and he was also instrumental in developing the protocol for the aging study, which was, the second aspect of our claim on performance. So he played a really important role, and I can't tell you what it was like to work around this gentleman. I mean, he was a rare individual, and these are special people. You meet great athletes, and then you meet academics, and then you meet you have a chance to work with two people, Dr. Bunos and Dr. Droge, who were the first in the world to publish in certain areas. And Dr. Droge was considered a world authority in redox physiology, and was the first person to work on glutathione in a living organism. So these are very special people, and the fact that we're able to recruit somebody like that, Dr. Droge told me that when he retired from the German National Cancer Institute, mandatory retirement at the age of 65, he had a stack of offers on his desk, but he came to Canada, and specifically he wanted to work on this aging study. And just a side note to that aging study, the person we did the aging study with at the University of Montreal is funded by some of the top institutes in the United States. And he said to me, John, people come to me with projects where you're talking about something, very esoteric with very little application to the general population. He said, that the study we're doing, looking at immunocal and physical performance in resistance exercise in the elderly population has such a broad application. And I think that's, the reason we're so lucky to have fallen into this opportunity is the breadth of the application of immunocal in terms of quality of life, both on the performance side as well as the prevention side. I mean, it's, absolutely unique.
And it's funny because I'm going to be speaking about the history of immunotech next week in Los Angeles, and John's been kind enough to share with me some of his notes on Dr. Droge, and I was going through them yesterday, and it's just amazing. I mean, just 2,000 papers as a result of his research. Over 2,000 individual papers had been written over the years, and the article that I'm referencing is 4 or 5 years old. So there's probably more than that. So, you know, I guess the point on this, John, just to wrap up, and I'd love your final thoughts on this, is when we go to work with this brand, we sometimes forget that we're standing on the shoulders of giants between Dr. Bunos, Dr. Kongshav, and Dr. Droge, some of the other doctors, Montagnier, Linsman, et cetera, Dr. Lewis. I mean, some are contemporary and some have passed on to the next life. But point being that we stand on the shoulders of scientific giants who were not interested in network marketing. They weren't here because we were a network marketing company. They were here because we were a research company first and foremost, going back to 1975, the original collaboration between Dr. Bunos and Dr. Kongshav, and then of course 1978, the first paper being published by the two of them. That's why these famous doctors have been here, John. But I'd love your comments on that or your thoughts on that.
Well, all I'll say is reputation is the most important thing for these doctors. And so you're not going to get famous doctors like this for no reason at all. The famous doctors, some doctors, you pay them a lot of money, and they'll say things, but those are not the type of doctors you want. You want doctors that are genuinely interested in the science. And, I was able to recruit and work with people because I had great teachings from Dr. Droge and Dr. Bunos about the type of people you need to work with, you need to recruit, and you need to, have involved in this. And so we're very fortunate. They were incredible people and incredible scientists.
Well,
I'd like
thank
to
you.
finish by answering Stefan's question on the scientific advisory board. Stefan, I'll give you, like the most important quality you can have, in a person in my position is what you don't know. And, we did research in many, many complex areas. And, I'll give you an example. When Dr. Bunos passed on, all of a sudden, all that knowledge on whey protein is gone. So I needed additional resources to be able to talk to on a daily basis, weekly basis, when we're running studies and we have to provide quality control data to the Canadian government, or we're looking at ways to improve or new formulations, et cetera. And so I was able to get one of the top consultants in the whey and milk industry who advised some of the biggest companies in Canada, the United States. So the scientific advisory board, in the truest sense, essentially advises the board of directors on the scientific affairs of the company and, the projects, et cetera. So they're the eyes and ears, but they also played a critical role for me when I was doing R&D, advising me on, the design of certain studies, the interpretation of data, et cetera. So they were great resources for me, and I used those, because I was not an expert, so I needed to be surrounded by experts.
Great.
Thank you for this background, John. This is amazing.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Stefan. Did you have another question?
I was just curious, maybe there are other personalities on this advisory board. Can you share a couple of bullet points to each of them? Is this still in our time? It would be amazing because, like we see the lady on in the third picture, Dr. Elvira Maria Hebert, or also Will Brink, and Dr. Dan Linsman. Is this something we you can share with us
Yeah,
about
I can
them?
speak about Dr. Linsman and Dr. Lewis because I was I worked with both of them. Dr. Gutman brought the other people on, but Dr. Linsman, I started collaborating with him back in 2014. He works at the University of Denver at the Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, and he developed our basic science on the brain and how immunocal impacts different pathologies in the brain in mild cognitive impairment, in commotions, concussions, as well as Lou Gehrig's disease. And Dr. Lewis worked at the Oracle, which was one of the top sports science firms in the world, and worked with athletes all over the world and used Immunical through multiple Olympic cycles with the English Olympic team, as well as other athletes, professional baseball, football, etc. So we had our clinical data, but we also had data from Oracle on what they were seeing using their analysis and their data. So it was gave us incredible insight. And as I tell people, it gave me the opportunity to see Immunical from one spectrum, which was a stage 4 cancer patient, all the way to the Olympic athlete. So we have a very broad perspective on how Immunical acts. So again, those people were very important resources for me in developing the clinical trials and papers and knowledge about the product.
Amazing. Thank you so much, John, for this
Right.
background.